Hey everyone, this is Phil, and today I want to talk to you about my camera history. So a couple months ago I was talking to my mom about going to visit her, and she mentioned that she wanted me to have her old film camera. I was born in the 80s, so I started out taking pictures on film cameras as a child, and then later transitioned to digital cameras, and now I'm back full circle. So it's kind of fun to look back at that camera history of mine, and I thought I might revisit some of those cameras, maybe pick a few of them up, take a couple of pictures of them, and I thought it would make an interesting video. So the first camera that I wanted to show you is, as I mentioned, my mom's SLR, which is a Minolta SRT 303. The Minolta SRT 303 was called different things in different markets. So it was branded as the SRT 102 in the US and SRT Super in Asia Pacific. This camera was released in the mid-70s and was marketed as a camera for advanced amateur photographers. So it has through the lens metering. It has a metering system which a lot of you might be familiar from Pentax cameras, that has a needle that indicates the proper exposure, and then a circle that you can move via the aperture dial or the speed dial. And once you have the needle inside the circle, that indicates you have proper exposure. The finder on this camera has indicators for the shutter speed, as well as a little window, which you can see up here, that looks down on the aperture. When I read that this was a full-featured finder that had aperture reading as well as speed readings, I couldn't figure out what that was, and I was really surprised to see that it's just a physical mirrored view that looks down at the aperture reading. I am actually quite fascinated with it. I love the concept. This camera is fully manual, so you set your ISO speed, you set your shutter speed, and you set your aperture, and it just goes by the readings that you set yourself. There's no automatic modes whatsoever. It has the ability to take double exposures by engaging the film release lever, and then once you advance, it pops back. So that's very interesting. And my mother actually mentioned that she enjoyed taking double exposures with this camera very much. So that's definitely a feature that I think she chose it for. And then it has a hot shoe on top. So you do not need a separate sync cable for the flash if you're using something like that. That is something that I never quite got used to. So it's not something that's very important to me. And then of course you have the self timer close to the aperture preview lever right here. That's pretty much all the features it has. It's a very standard, straightforward SLR camera from the 70s. This is actually the first camera that I took proper photographs on. I was in the school's photography class for a very, very short time. Unfortunately, our teacher moved on, and she was the only one who had the expertise to teach us about the darkroom. I enjoyed that very much, and that is actually the only time that I used an SLR camera. So this is the only SLR that I've ever used, which is very funny because most people stick with SLRs for most of their life. I've just been shooting rangefinders. The first compact camera that I used, which probably predates this a little bit, since I used it as a very small child whenever my mom was taking pictures of the family, was a Canon Snappy 35. I recently found one in a used store for about 1,000 yen, and I texted a picture to my mom and told her, hey, look what I found. And she told me, don't buy it, it's crap. So I didn't. One I did get is the first camera that I remember owning, which is funny because my mom says we got it for her, but all I ever remember is me using it the entire time. So This is the Canon Ixus L1. This camera again was branded differently in different markets. It was called the ELF series in the US and then the Ixi 301 in Japan. As you can see, this is quite beat. I recovered it from our cupboard in my mom's apartment, and unfortunately it doesn't turn on anymore, so there's something broken inside. Fortunately, I was able to find a working copy at a store over here in Japan. Something that I've noticed in Japan quite a lot. People seem to be taking very, very good care of their equipment. It's rarely scratched or non-functional. All the stuff that you find secondhand over here is in very good condition. So this camera is a APS camera. So what APS was supposed to be an evolution of consumer grade 35mm photography, in which the film was encased in a cartridge. So there was nothing sticking out of the cartridge when you bought it, and it retracted completely into the cartridge once you're done with it. And on some cameras you were even able to switch the film mid-film. So you would tell the camera that you want to switch film, and it would retract the entire film into the cartridge. You would swap out the cartridge, and once you swapped it back, it would actually go back to the last picture that you've taken. So it was a quite intelligent format that recorded some extra data, like the dates taken, the kind of exposure that it had, yada yada. This camera was obviously a low-end consumer grade camera, so it didn't have a lot of the extra features of the APS system, but still it's a very nice and easy to use camera that I've actually enjoyed using quite a bit after I got this from a secondhand store for about 200 yen, I might add. So that's about $2 US. Unfortunately, obviously all the film for this camera is expired since manufacturers stopped making it in 2012. And I've been very hard pressed to find any film for this. I'm still looking for some of the Konica film that was made for it, because I'm very fond of that film in 35mm. But there was probably less produced of that one, so it might be very hard to find. This camera has a very limited feature set. It has the PHC selector, so panoramic high definition, I think is what it is, and then classic, and that is the aspect ratio of the photo. So APS cameras actually enable you to select an aspect ratio of the photo. It would select a portion of of the film area, and it would show that in the viewfinder as well, and then the developing place would develop it at the same height, but then increased width. So it was actually basically just cropping and zooming into the picture. And I remember the panoramic photos being very expensive to develop, so I didn't use it a lot. Most of the time I just had it just set into the H mode, which was the standard aspect ratio for the pictures. The pictures, I remember once you get them back from the developer, they came in like a box with the cartridge on one side, because you didn't get the negatives out of the cartridge, it stayed in the cartridge. And then the pictures on the other side, and it was like a box like this, and needlessly opulent features for consumer grade photography, but it was interesting and fun at the time. This camera also has the very annoying 90s feature of setting the flash to auto once you turn it on, and not remembering your preference after you shut it off and on again. So the flash is at auto every time you turn it on, and you have to switch it off again, which is very common with compact cameras at the time. And yeah, you have to push the flash button 3 times to set it to the off setting, and then you can take pictures without fear of flashing your flash into random people's eyes. I took this out on the streets of Tokyo and shot a couple of rolls with it, and I was actually very pleasantly surprised at how the pictures came out. Obviously the film is expired, so there's a slight shift in color, but I actually enjoyed what it looked like. It had very strong contrast, obviously very sharp pictures, and I think this was just a family camera that takes sharp pictures in any environment, and had a decently pleasant look to it, but nothing out of the ordinary. It's extremely small, smaller than what you would manage with a 35mm film camera. Just for that, it's nice to have. So if you would like to learn more about this camera, I would be interested in doing a separate video on this sometime. So let me know in the comments if you're interested in that. And then, of course, in 1999, I graduated from high school, and I started working right away, and with my first salary, I went out and bought a digital camera. Digital cameras at the time were becoming more commonplace, were becoming more affordable for regular people, and I got for about $1,200 converted this thing. It's a Fuji Finepix 2700. It has 2.3 megapixels, about an inch diagonal LCD, and not a lot of other features. So once you turn it on, it starts loading, unloading, and then it turns on. As you can tell from just the boot up sequence, this camera is very slow. So I bought this off of the Japanese equivalent of eBay for about 2,000 yen or 20 bucks. And I used it for a couple times, and unlike the APS camera that I just showed you, it was not too fun to use. So it was very slow, slow to focus, slow to save pictures. The menu system is very bare bones. There's not a lot of things that you can do with it. It saves onto smart media cards, which I found this very cool little camera card with a Pikachu on it, and apparently there was some kind of promotion involved where you could load clips from the anime directly on this smart media card and watch it on your camera or your computer. Smart media was a short-lived predecessor to SD cards and all the other cards we have right now. I was actually very hard pressed to even find a reader for this thing. This card ended up getting corrupted twice when I used it. I had some jumbled pictures. So as I mentioned, I went out and shot a couple pictures with it, and here's some of the pictures that I got. Yeah, I wouldn't use this on a regular basis. It was fun to have it back. It made me very reminiscent about it, but technology has advanced from this infant stage so much that this just feels like a pain to use. It's a nice thing to have in the room. I will just put it on a shelf somewhere to remind me of my youth. So after this Fuji Finepix, I switched to Panasonic Lumix cameras. So I had a couple of Panasonic Lumix compacts. The one that I remember most fondly is the Lumix DMC LC33, which is something I bought just before I came to Japan for the first time. And it was a nice camera. I did not get this again because one, I didn't find it, and two, it is still a very capable camera. I think, so it wouldn't be that interesting to have it back. It had a Leica branded lens, and it was, some of the photos I got out of it still look good to this day, so not that interesting. What is interesting is that right around that time, when I came to Japan for the first time in 2004, cell phone cameras started getting really good. And this is not smartphones, this is before that, this is feature phones. So some of the Japanese feature phones from that time actually had really decent cameras in them. And here's some of the photos and the phones that I used at this time. And after that, when I started my job in Japan, mirrorless cameras started coming out. So Olympus and Panasonic had created the Micro Four Thirds group, and they started coming out with these cameras. And the first one was a Panasonic camera that looked like an SLR, so it didn't look like the cameras I was used to using, and I didn't like it very much. But then Olympus came out with the Pen EP1, and I was just in love. That camera just looked so good. It was a very nice, very classically styled rangefinder looking camera, and I just jumped on that. And that was the first camera that I consciously used with exchangeable lenses, and that's the end of my camera history, because after that I just kept going and going. So I had the EP1, the EP3, then I got the PNF, and I got my first film camera that I bought as an adult, which was my Folklander Bessa RF, and I got my Olympus 33 DC, my SP, my Fuji GW690, a Mamiya 645 that I let go very shortly after, a Mamiya 6, a Mamiya 7, and a whole slew of other film cameras. And I'm not going to show you all of that because that would take a whole nother video. Thank you for sticking with me through this lengthy rundown of my old cameras. These are mostly more consumer grade than I think what you see mostly on film photography channels. So it might have been fun to see for a few of you. I hope so. It was fun for me to go back to those cameras and shoot a little bit with them and reminisce about the golden times of my youth. And please do like and subscribe. You know, all the stuff that YouTube creators ask you to do. I do have a Patreon, I have an Instagram, and I would love if you check those out. Links are down below. And thank you again. Hope to see you again in the next one.